The cold seeped through the thin mattress, a damp and indifferent chill that settled deep in Sophia's bones. In the dim light of the women's shelter, rows of identical cots stretched out like graves, each holding a woman life had tried to bury. Sophia was just one of them, a ghost among ghosts. She was 25, but her reflection in the grimy window showed a woman aged by grief and fear. She pressed a hand to her swollen belly, where a tiny, insistent life kicked against her palm. It was the only warmth she had left. In this vast, echoing room filled with the quiet sobs and restless sighs of strangers, the beat of her son's heart was the loneliest sound in the world. She was surrounded by a sea of forgotten women, yet the emptiness beside her was an ocean. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, he was there. The scent of motor oil and cheap cologne, the sound of his easy laugh that promised her a future free from the shadows of her past in the foster system. He had promised her a world, a small, warm world just for them. But the world had a cruel sense of humor. One screech of tires on wet pavement had stolen it all, leaving her with nothing but a fading memory and a life growing inside her, a life he would never meet. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making each breath a struggle. He was gone, and in his absence, the silence was a constant deafening roar, reminding her that she was, and always had been, utterly alone. The daily humiliations were a slow, grinding erosion of her soul. At the soup line, the woman ladling watery stew into her bowl looked right through her, her eyes filled with a weary disdain reserved for the desperate. Sophia would take the meager portion with a quiet, "Thank you," her voice barely a whisper, fighting to hold on to the last shreds of her dignity. She wasn't a beggar. She was a grieving mother-to-be, a woman who once had a job, a home, a love. But here, she was just another mouth to feed, another problem to manage. She ate slowly, forcing down the tasteless food, her stomach churning with a hunger that wasn't just for sustenance. It was a hunger for respect, for a single human glance that didn't hold pity or contempt. Every kick, every flutter inside her was a bittersweet symphony of love and terror. The doctor at the free clinic had spoken in clipped, hurried tones about a potential complication, a shadow on the ultrasound that required specialized monitoring she could never afford. The words echoed in her mind, a relentless drumbeat of failure. How could she protect this tiny, perfect life when she couldn't even protect herself from the cold? The fear was a poison, seeping into her bloodstream, whispering that she was already failing him. She had spent her entire life as a ward of the state, a child lost in the system. She had sworn, on the last night she held his father, that their son would never know that kind of abandonment. Now, that promise felt like a cruel joke. One night, as the rain lashed against the shelter's windows, the weight of it all became unbearable. She saw her future stretched out before her, a cycle of poverty and despair, a life where her son would inherit her loneliness. The promise she made to him, to his father, surfaced not as a memory, but as a command. He will not be like you. He will have a family. He will have a name. It was in that moment of absolute darkness that the idea sparked. A reckless, impossible flame born not of greed, but of a mother's fierce, primal love. It wasn't a plan for her survival, but for his. She would not let her son become another forgotten child. She would tear down the world to give him a place in it, even if it meant becoming a monster to do so. The Vance Tower was a monument of glass and steel, a cold finger pointing accusingly at the sky. Sophia stood before it, a ghost in a borrowed coat, feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. The plan, born in the suffocating silence of the shelter, now felt like madness. It was a desperate, ugly thing, a lie wrapped around a shard of truth. She was going to walk into that fortress and claim its king was the father of her child, not for the money, not for the fame, but for a name, for a connection, for the promise she whispered to a man whose face was already starting to fade from her memory. She took a deep breath, the city's frigid air burning her lungs. This wasn't an act of greed. It was an act of war, waged by a mother with nothing left to lose. Her entrance was met with the kind of polite, sterile hostility reserved for things that don't belong. The receptionist, a woman with hair as sharp as her smile, looked at Sophia's worn boots and then back at her face, her eyes sweeping over the swell of her belly with clinical disdain. "Do you have an appointment?" The question was a dismissal. Sophia's voice was barely a whisper, but it was steady. "I need to see Adrian Vance." The receptionist's smile tightened. "Mr. Vance doesn't see anyone without an appointment." She was a gatekeeper to a world Sophia could never enter, and her judgment was a wall of ice. But Sophia didn't move. She couldn't. Behind her, the doors to the street were the doors to failure. She stood her ground, enduring the woman's icy stare until a junior assistant was summoned, a young man whose ambition was etched into his tense posture. He repeated the same lines, the same dismissive script. It was then, with her heart hammering against her ribs, that Sophia played her only card. The words felt like poison on her tongue, a betrayal of the love she carried. "Please," she said, her voice cracking just enough to sound convincing. "Just tell him. The mother of his child is here." The lie hung in the air, thick and shocking. The assistant's professional mask slipped, replaced by a flicker of alarm and intrigue. He saw a scandal, not a soul. And just like that, the impenetrable fortress had a breach. They led her not to an office, but to a small windowless waiting room, a glass box where she could be observed like a strange specimen. The whispers started immediately, slithering through the pristine corridors of the 40th floor. Employees slowed as they passed, their gazes a blend of contempt and morbid curiosity. They saw the bump under her cheap coat, the desperation in her eyes, and they drew their own conclusions. She was a gold digger, a shameless opportunist, a story they would tell over expensive lunches. Each condemning glance was a small cut, bleeding her of the little dignity she had left. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, a silent, desperate prayer that her son couldn't feel their judgment through her skin. To them she was a simple, ugly equation. A poor, pregnant woman plus a reclusive billionaire equals an extortion attempt. No one in that gleaming tower could possibly imagine the truth. They couldn't see the ghost of a young man on a motorcycle, his laughter echoing in her heart. They couldn't hear the doctor's cautious words about a shadow on an ultrasound screen, a potential danger that kept her awake at night. They only saw what they were conditioned to see, a threat to the order of their world, a piece of the gutter that had washed up on their marble floors. The narrator, watching this unfold, knew the truth. Her crime wasn't greed. It was a love so fierce it was willing to wear the mask of deceit. If this story is touching you, please like and share. So many people live through this kind of judgment in silence. Inside her own mind, a storm of shame and resolve raged. Was this the right thing to do? The lie felt heavy, a stain on the memory of the man she loved. She was desecrating his legacy to save his son. Every kick, every flutter from within, was both a comfort and an accusation. He was real, he was innocent, and he deserved more than a life of forgotten files and indifferent caseworkers. He deserved a family, a history, a chance. She caught her reflection in the polished surface of the table, a pale, haunted face. She didn't recognize the woman staring back. She had become a liar, an invader, but she was also a mother, and a mother will burn down the world for her child. The wait stretched into hours, a deliberate tactic to unnerve her, to make her feel insignificant. Finally, the door opened, but it wasn't Adrian Vance. It was a woman in a severe grey suit, her expression unreadable. She introduced herself as his legal counsel. Her eyes were like chips of stone, assessing Sophia not as a person, but as a liability. "Mr. Vance has agreed to see you," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "And he has 10 minutes. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons, a problem to be managed and disposed of." Sophia rose on trembling legs, her hand instinctively going to her belly. This was it. She was about to face the man she was trying to deceive, the cold, distant brother of the man she had loved. The doors to his office were massive, opening into a space that felt more like a mausoleum than a workplace. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of the city below, a world he owned but did not touch. And there, standing against the light, was Adrian Vance. He was a silhouette of power, his posture rigid, his face a mask of controlled fury. He didn't look at her, he looked through her, his eyes filled with a chilling contempt that made the receptionist's judgment feel like a caress. In his gaze, she saw the full weight of her lie. He saw a parasite, a con artist. He saw everything he had despised about his brother's life, and he was ready to crush her. His office was less a room and more a void, suspended 50 stories above the city. It was a sterile kingdom of glass, chrome, and Italian leather, where the only warmth came from the faint hum of a hidden server. Adrian Vance stood before the window, his back to the door, a sentinel guarding a self-imposed exile. He didn't look down at the sprawling metropolis as a king would his domain, but as a warden would his prison. Every street, every light, was a reminder of the messy, emotional world he had meticulously cut himself off from. He was a man who had built an empire of steel and concrete, yet lived in an emptiness of his own design. He was waiting, not with anticipation, but with the cold, methodical patience of a man about to dissect a problem. When the heavy oak doors opened, he did not turn. He watched her reflection in the glass, a small, frayed figure swallowed by the immense space. Sofia Rivas. She looked exactly as he had imagined, worn, desperate, and carrying the palpable scent of the streets. Her coat was too thin, her boots were scuffed, and her belly, swollen with his supposed child, was the centerpiece of her audacious claim. He saw not a woman in pain, but a manifestation of his brother's chaos, a final, greedy ghost come to haunt him. In his mind, the verdict was already delivered. She was a parasite, another piece of human wreckage left in his brother's destructive wake, and he would scrape her from his life with surgical precision. He finally turned, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, were devoid of any emotion. They were tools of assessment, and they found her wanting. "So," he began, his voice a low, chilling sound that cut through the silence. He didn't address her directly, instead speaking to the two lawyers flanking him. "This is the woman who believes a lie can be turned into a fortune." The words were not an accusation, they were a statement of fact. He walked around his desk, a massive slab of polished granite that served as a barricade between his world and hers. "Let's be clear. You are trespassing. You are attempting extortion. And you have made a catastrophic miscalculation." He saw her flinch, a tiny, satisfying tremor. Sophia's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice, when it came, was steady. It was a small sound in that vast, silent room, but it did not break. "I am not here for your money," she said, her gaze fixed on a point just past his shoulder. She could not meet those icy eyes. The lie she had constructed felt fragile, ready to shatter under the weight of his contempt. But beneath the lie was a truth as solid as the ground beneath her feet, the fierce and unwavering love for her unborn son. She wasn't fighting for herself. She was a soldier for him. This man saw a beggar, a fraud. He could not see the mother, and that was her only shield. Her quiet defiance was an unexpected variable in his controlled world, and it irritated him. One of the lawyers, a woman with a face as severe as her suit, stepped forward, holding a tablet like a weapon. "Ms. Rivas, we have documented your claim, a claim, I might add, that constitutes slander and defamation. Mr. Vance is prepared to countersue for damages that will financially cripple you for the remainder of your life." The other lawyer chimed in, his voice smoother but no less menacing. "We will subpoena your bank records, your phone records, your employment history. We will expose every corner of your life to prove this is a malicious fabrication." They were wolves, circling her, their legal jargon a series of snaps and growls designed to make her cower and flee. Adrian watched, silent and approving, letting his dogs do their work. Then Adrian raised a hand, silencing them. He leaned against his desk, the picture of calm, predatory power. "However," he said, a cruel hint of a smile touching his lips, "I am a man who appreciates efficiency. I will entertain your little fantasy, but on my terms." He looked directly at her belly. "We will conduct a paternity test immediately. It will be administered by my physician at a lab of my choosing. We will also conduct an ultrasound under the same supervision." The narrator knew his heart. This wasn't a concession. It was the forging of a weapon. He didn't want the truth. He wanted legal proof of her lie. He wanted an official document that he could use to utterly and completely destroy her. In that moment, the chasm between them was absolute. He, a man insulated by wealth, saw her as a simple problem of greed. He could not conceive of a desperation so profound it would lead a woman to commit such a desperate act for something other than money. And she, a woman who had known nothing but struggle, saw in him the embodiment of a cold, transactional world that had always tried to crush her. They were two souls grieving the same man, yet they stood on opposite sides of a war, blinded by their own pain. His guilt over his brother's life had curdled into a permanent rage, and he was aiming all of it at the woman who dared to carry his brother's legacy. Sophia met his gaze for the first time. The terror was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a mother's resolve. She saw the trap he was laying. She knew that agreeing meant walking into her own public execution, but it was also the only path forward. The DNA test would shatter her lie, but it would also reveal the truth she had hidden beneath it, that her son was a Vance. It was a gamble that would cost her everything she had left, but it was for a prize far greater than herself. With a deep breath that felt like it was tearing her apart, she gave a single, quiet nod. "I agree," she said, and with those two words, the battle began. Do you believe in second chances? Comment below. We want to hear from you. The medical clinic was another of Adrian's fortresses, a sterile, white-walled extension of his own cold world. Sophia sat on the edge of an examination table, the paper crinkling beneath her, feeling less like a patient and more like a piece of evidence. The air was thick with a silent, antiseptic hostility. Adrian stood near the door, a sentinel of disdain flanked by his lawyer, a woman whose sharp suit seemed to be an extension of her sharp, predatory gaze. Sophia was an intruder here, a contamination in their pristine environment. She clutched the thin fabric of her coat, her knuckles white. She had walked into the lion's den willingly, but the sheer oppressive weight of their judgment was suffocating. Every breath was a battle against the instinct to run. From his vantage point, Adrian watched her with a chilling sense of detachment. He catalogued her every move, the slight tremor in her hands, the way she avoided eye contact, the protective curve of her arms around her belly. He interpreted it all as guilt, the nervous energy of a liar whose elaborate con was about to unravel. A cold, grim satisfaction settled in his chest. This was what his brother had courted: chaos, desperation, and the inevitable, messy fallout. He saw Sophia not as a person, but as the final pathetic invoice for his brother's irresponsibility. He was here to settle that debt, not with compassion, but with the full, crushing force of his legal and financial power. This clinical dismantling was the only language he trusted. The doctor, a man whose career was indebted to the Vance family, moved with a practiced, impersonal efficiency. He spoke to Sophia, but his words were directed at Adrian and the lawyer. He explained the procedures, the blood draw for the paternity test, the ultrasound to verify the pregnancy's term, in a flat, technical monotone that stripped the experience of all humanity. Sophia was a subject, a collection of biological data to be logged and analyzed. When he placed the cold stethoscope on her back, she flinched, not from the temperature, but from the sheer indignity of it all. In this room, she was not a mother-to-be, filled with hopes and fears. She was a variable in an equation of liability, and they were all waiting to solve for zero. Sophia's resistance was a silent, internal war. She answered the doctor's questions with single words, her voice a low murmur. She refused to give them anything more. She would not offer up the story of her morning sickness, the ache in her back, or the fierce, protective love that pulsed through her veins with every beat of her heart. Those things were hers, sacred and untouched by their cynical world. They could examine her body, draw her blood, and peer into her womb with their machines, but they could not have her soul. She built a wall of silence around herself and her son, a quiet defiance that was her last remaining armor. She would not weep, she would not beg, she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. The tension was shattered by the shrill ring of Adrian's phone. He answered it with a clipped, irritated tone, putting it on speaker without a second thought for Sophia's presence. The voice that filled the room was brittle and sharp, dripping with aristocratic venom. "Adrian, what is this I hear? A pregnant woman from the gutter is dragging our name through the mud. Your father would be turning in his grave. You need to handle this. You need to bury her." Sophia sat frozen on the table, the voice of Adrian's mother piercing her fragile composure. Each word was a public stoning, reinforcing what they all thought of her. She was not a person. She was a problem to be handled, a piece of trash to be buried. For a brief, almost imperceptible moment, Adrian's gaze flickered towards Sophia. He expected to see tears, a flash of anger, some dramatic reaction to his mother's brutal words. Instead, He saw nothing. She simply absorbed the blow, her expression unchanged, her posture still. She just sat there, enduring it, as if she had been weathering storms like this her entire life. This quiet, unnerving dignity was a foreign concept to him. It didn't fit the profile of a desperate gold digger. The momentary confusion was unsettling, a crack in the foundation of his certainty. He quickly dismissed it. It was a trick, a performance. He hardened his heart again. The cold rage, a more comfortable and familiar companion. A nurse entered to draw blood for the paternity test, her movements brisk and detached. She wrapped a tight band around Sophia's arm, swiped it with alcohol, and slid the needle into her vein. Sophia turned her head away, her eyes fixing on a water stain on the ceiling tile, focusing on its shape, its imperfection. Anything to distract from the violation. The lawyer watched the entire process with an unnerving intensity, ensuring the vials were labeled correctly, the forms signed, the chain of custody legally airtight. This blood, the very essence of her life and her child's, was now just a sample in a plastic bag, a piece of evidence that would be used to prove she was a liar and a fraud. After the nurse left, Adrian's lawyer stepped forward, holding out a bottle of water and a protein bar. "Dennis, you should have something," she said, her tone not of concern but of pragmatic necessity. "We don't want any delays." The gesture was a calculated insult, treating her as if she were a piece of delicate machinery that needed fuel to complete its function. Sophia looked from the offering to the lawyer's impassive face. In that moment, all her fear and humiliation coalesced into a single point of pure, unyielding pride. "No, thank you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm fine." It was a small act, a rejection of their sterile, transactional pity, but it was hers. She would not be managed. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The only sound was the low hum of the ultrasound machine, a quiet thrum of anticipation. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the sterile white room. Adrian resumed his position by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, a statue carved from impatience and contempt. His lawyer reviewed her notes, her pen making quiet, scratching sounds on the paper. Sophia remained on the table, her hands resting on her belly, a silent communion with the only person in the world who was on her side. The air grew thick with unspoken accusations and defended secrets. This was the final moment before the curtain was pulled back, and the tension was a physical presence, pressing in on them all. The doctor cleared his throat, breaking the spell. He held the ultrasound wand, looking to Adrian for the final go-ahead. This was the precipice. For Adrian, it was the moment before his complete and total vindication, the final nail in the coffin of her fraudulent claim. He gave a sharp, decisive nod, his face an unreadable mask of stone. For Sophia, this was the ultimate surrender. She was about to lay the most precious, vulnerable part of her life bare before her enemies. She took a deep, shuddering breath, a silent prayer on her lips. She had resisted their power, endured their judgment, and held on to her dignity by a thread. Now, all she could do was watch. The doctor applied the cold gel to Sophia's swollen belly, a clinical, impersonal touch that made her skin crawl. The room was silent except for the low hum of the ultrasound machine. Adrian and his legal team stood like statues of judgment near the wall, their faces impassive, their eyes missing nothing. This was the moment of her execution, the final, undeniable proof of her lie. Sophia closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable humiliation. She felt utterly exposed, not just physically, but emotionally. Her son, her most precious secret, was about to become a piece of evidence in their cold, transactional war. She sent a silent prayer to him, an apology for bringing him into this sterile, hostile world. Her body was a battlefield, and she was losing. The doctor moved the wand, and a grainy, black-and-white image flickered to life on the monitor. A world within a world, and then a sound, a rhythmic, powerful whoosh that filled the sterile room with undeniable life. Thump, 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 thump. The sound of her son's heart. Adrian's gaze was fixed on the screen, his expression unchanged. He was a scientist observing data, searching for the flaw in her argument. He saw gestational age, measurements, clinical facts. He saw a pregnancy, but he did not yet see a person. To him, this was the final piece of the puzzle, the image that would confirm the timeline and seal her fate as a fraud. He felt a cold flicker of triumph. The truth was seconds away, and it would be his weapon. But for Sophia, the world outside that screen ceased to exist. All the fear, the hunger, the judgment, it all dissolved in the face of that miraculous image. She saw a tiny, perfect spine, the curve of a head, a small hand, balled into a fist, moving near a face she could only imagine. It was the first time she had truly seen him, not as a complication or a burden, but as her son. A wave of love so fierce and so absolute washed over her. It was a physical blow. It stole her breath, cracked open her carefully constructed armor, and exposed the raw, aching heart of a mother. The fight was over. There was no strategy left, no lie to maintain. There was only him. The first tear was a betrayal, slipping from the corner of her eye and tracing a hot path down her temple. Then another, and another. A silent, heartbreaking sob shook her frame. She wasn't acting. She wasn't performing for her captors. She had forgotten they were even there. Her hand came up to cover her mouth, trying to stifle the sound of her own breaking heart. These were the tears she had swallowed in the shelter, the grief she had choked down in the soup line, the terror she had hidden from the world. It was a flood of pure, unfiltered emotion, the agonizing love for a child she feared she couldn't protect, and the profound sorrow for the man who would never see him. And then, in a voice so quiet it was barely a whisper, a private prayer not meant for their ears, she spoke to the screen. "Look, Leo, my love." The name fell into the sterile silence of the room, like a stone into a frozen lake, cracking the surface of everything. Leo, his brother's name. A name she could not have known, could not have guessed. It was a secret password, spoken from a place of pure love. Adrian's breath caught in his throat. The sound of his brother's name, uttered with such familiar, devastating tenderness, bypassed every defense he had ever built. The room, the lawyers, the ultrasound. It all faded to a dull roar in his ears. He was no longer in a clinic. He was standing in the past. The image of his brother, laughing as he worked on his motorcycle, flashed behind Adrian's eyes with blinding clarity. He saw Leo, not as the failure he had judged, but as a man capable of this kind of love, this kind of devotion, a love so real it had created this life, beating strong and steady on the screen. The entire narrative he had constructed, the story of a greedy woman and his irresponsible brother, shattered into a million pieces. The woman on the table wasn't a con artist. She was Leo's love. She was a widow. And the child on that screen was not a lie. It was his brother's son. It was the last piece of Leo left on Earth, and he had been treating it like a corporate liability. The loss of control was not a violent eruption, but a silent, catastrophic implosion. The cold fury that had been his shield for years evaporated, leaving behind a raw, gaping wound of guilt. He had hated his brother for being reckless, for being emotional, for being everything Adrian was not. But now, seeing Sophia's genuine grief, he realized his coldness wasn't strength. It was a sickness. He had let his brother die feeling judged and alone, and now he was doing the same thing to the woman Leo loved. The weight of his own cruelty crashed down on him, and for the first time in a decade, Adrian Vance felt the sting of tears threatening to form in his own eyes. He saw her then, truly saw her for the first time. Not as the problem, the trespasser, the parasite. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes. He saw the fierce, protective curve of her hand on her belly. He saw a woman who had walked through fire, not for money, but for the memory of the man he had failed. Her audacious lie was not an act of greed. It was an act of desperation, an act of a mother fighting for her child's right to exist, to have a name, to belong to a family. She had been honoring his brother in her own broken, desperate way, while he, Adrian, had only been trying to erase him. The shame was a physical burn in his chest. An instinct he thought had died with his brother, a deep, primal need to protect, surged through him with the force of a tidal wave. This woman and her child were not a threat. They were family. They were his. He took a single, involuntary step forward, his polished shoes making a soft sound on the linoleum floor. His lawyers turned to him, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm at the sudden, tectonic shift in his demeanor. The man of ice was gone, replaced by someone they didn't recognize. He was no longer looking at a legal case. He was looking at his nephew, He was looking at the only chance he had left for redemption. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse, fractured. It was the voice of a man who had been broken open. "Turn it off," he said to the doctor. The words sharp but heavy, with an emotion no one in that room had ever heard from him. The doctor fumbled with the controls, and the screen went black. The rhythmic sound of the tiny heart was gone, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Adrian then turned his gaze to his legal team, his eyes burning with a new, unfamiliar fire. "Get out," he commanded, his voice low and absolute. "Both of you, leave us." It was not a dismissal. It was the sound of a king reclaiming his humanity, alone in the ruins of his own cold kingdom. The silence left behind was a vacuum, pulling all the air from the sterile room. The doctor, caught in the emotional crossfire, fumbled with his charts, avoiding the gaze of the man who had just dismantled his own world. Adrian did not move. He stood in the center of the room, a titan brought to his knees not by a rival, but by a memory and a whispered name. He looked at Sophia, who was slowly sitting up, her face streaked with tears but her eyes clear. He saw the ghost of his brother in the defiant set of her jaw. His first act as a changed man was not a grand speech, but a quiet command. "Leave," he said to the doctor, his voice raspy. The doctor fled. Adrian then walked to Sophia, removed his $1,000 cashmere coat, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. He didn't speak of money or apologies. Those words were useless now, insults to the profound grief that connected them. Instead, he spoke of necessities, his voice raw with an unfamiliar urgency. "You are not going back there," he stated, the words an unbreakable vow. "The shelter, the streets, that is over. You and the baby require proper medical supervision. The best, I will see to it." It wasn't an offer of charity. It was a declaration of fierce, protective ownership born from a place of deep guilt. He was not saving her. He was trying to save the last remnant of his brother, the last chance he had to atone for a lifetime of judgment. He looked at her, his eyes pleading for her to understand that this was not about power, but penance. Sophia clutched the soft fabric of the coat, its warmth a startling contrast to the cold she had grown used to. She looked into his eyes, searching for the cruel tycoon who had dissected her with his contempt just minutes before. He was gone. In his place was a man drowning in a sorrow that mirrored her own. Her pride, her last and most loyal companion, screamed at her to refuse, to walk away. But then she felt a gentle kick from within, a reminder that this was no longer just her fight. This man was not offering her a handout. He was offering her son a future, a family. With a strength that came from a place deeper than pride, she gave a single, deliberate nod. "For Leo," she said, her voice clear and steady, "not for her, for him." The journey from the clinic was a silent, surreal passage between worlds. Adrian drove himself, dismissing his chauffeur with a wave. He gently placed Sophia's single, battered bag in the back seat, as if it were precious cargo. Inside the cavernous luxury of the Rolls-Royce, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and silver. A world that had once seemed so hostile now held at a safe distance behind soundproof glass. They didn't speak. There were no words for the chasm of grief and misunderstanding that had separated them, nor for the fragile bridge they were now building over it. He was a man learning the foreign language of care, and she was a woman daring to believe that a door, once slammed in her face, could actually open. His penthouse was a palace in the sky, a monument to a life of beautiful, sterile isolation. He led her not to a guest room, but to a warm, inviting suite with a view of the stars that seemed close enough to touch. He showed her the amenities with a clumsy, unpracticed formality, then simply said, "Rest. No one will bother you." He left, quietly closing the door behind him, leaving her in a silence that was not empty, but full of peace. Sophia walked to the window and looked down at the city that had tried to swallow her whole. She laid a hand on her belly, feeling the steady, rhythmic life within. The reward wasn't the silk sheets or the panoramic view. It was the profound, soul-deep relief of a locked door. It was the feeling of safety. It was justice. 3 months had transformed the penthouse from a sterile gallery of wealth into a home. The guest suite, once a place of temporary refuge, was now a sun-drenched nursery, filled not with expensive trinkets, but with the quiet hum of a mother's hope. Sophia moved with a newfound grace, her body heavy with life, her spirit no longer burdened by the constant threat of survival. The fear that had once been her shadow was replaced by a calm resolve. She was no longer the ghost from the shelter, invisible and judged. In this quiet space, surrounded by the soft colors of a future she was building herself, she was simply a mother. She would fold a tiny blanket, her hands steady, her heart full, finally at peace. Adrian Vance, the man who had built walls around his heart, now found himself dismantling them brick by brick. His evenings no longer ended with market reports and solitude, but with a quiet, hesitant knock on the nursery door. He would enter not as a landlord, but as an uncle, his gaze softening as he watched Sophia prepare for the baby's arrival. One night, he brought a small and worn wooden bird, a toy he and Leo had shared as children. It was a clumsy, heartfelt offering, an artifact from a past he was finally learning to embrace rather than bury. The silence in his home was no longer the sound of emptiness. It was the sound of waiting, of a wound slowly, miraculously beginning to heal. One evening, sitting in the soft glow of a lamp, Sophia showed Adrian a faded photograph, the only one she had of Leo. His face split in a wide, carefree grin. "He said he was going to teach our son how to fix an engine," she whispered, a sad smile touching her lips. Adrian didn't flinch from the memory. Instead, he took the photo, his fingers tracing the outline of his brother's face. "He couldn't even fix a toaster," Adrian confessed, his voice thick with an old, forgotten affection, but he would have tried. In that shared moment of grief and love, the last barrier between them crumbled. They were not a billionaire and a rescued woman. They were just two people who missed the same man, united in their duty to his legacy. As the due date approached, the unspoken question of a name hung in the air. Sophia finally broke the silence. "His name is Leo," she said, her voice full of certainty. "It was always going to be Leo." Adrian looked at her, his eyes holding a depth of emotion she had never seen before. He walked to the window, watching the city lights blur below. "He will need a last name," he said, turning back to her. "Leo Vance." It was not a command or a gift of status. It was an act of profound restoration, a promise that his brother's son would never be an outsider. He was officially claiming his nephew, not with a legal document, but with a name that mended a broken family line. The hospital room was quiet, a peaceful harbor after the storm of birth. Sophia held her son, Leo Vance, her world condensed to the tiny, perfect being sleeping in her arms. Adrian stood by the door, watching them, no longer a distant sentinel but a guardian. He approached slowly, his usual imposing presence softened into something gentle, almost reverent. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and placed a hand on the baby's head, his touch impossibly light. In that silent, sacred gesture, a family was forged. The tycoon, the survivor, and the child who had connected them, three broken pieces that together had finally become whole. The city outside could roar, but in this room, there was only the quiet rhythm of a new beginning. Back in the penthouse, Sophia stood at the door of the nursery, holding the key. It was just a small piece of metal, but it was the key to a life she never dared to dream of, a life of safety, belonging, and peace. Adrian watched her from the end of the hall, a silent partner in this new reality they had built from the ashes of their shared grief. He gave a small, affirming nod. Her journey had not started with a plea for help, but with a desperate, misunderstood act of war for her son. Now, the war was over. She had not won a fortune. She had won a family. Dignity, once a distant memory, was now the very air she breathed. If this moved you, subscribe to the channel and send this video to someone who needs hope.